So my talk today is about dogs. That's what obviously Steve was talking about. Very near and dear to Red Monk's heart. Just kidding. So yes, my journey here was pretty ridiculous. The title of my talk today is going to be Two Wolves. It's not necessarily about my dogs, but I did drive here from Austin, Texas with my two pups here. And we spent 2 days racing a hurricane and losing. So needless to say, I like a little bit of struggle. And there's certainly a lot of struggle in this talk. So at the 2015 Linux Foundation Collaborator Summit, Jim Zemlin almost declared that it was the golden age of open source. He celebrated things like that we had finally gotten our Red Hat 2.0 Hortonworks. There were apparently, for the Linux kernel itself, more contributors than ever before. And I think most importantly, while they were not yet a sponsor of the Linux Foundation, even Microsoft loved Linux. And this was huge. And we were on the edge of what appeared to be an open source first software paradigm, the cloud. And so everything seemed super, super great. Now, you'll note that in my previous slide, I said almost, because there was also a massive problem that had started poking its head in 2014. Who's familiar with this logo? Yes. And so this was actually a massive challenge to the Linux Foundation and their message of sending open source into every commercial enterprise they could, largely due to the fact that it appeared to be a failure of the very classic Linus's law, which is to say, with enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. And so, if this was true, how is it the case that we were having these catastrophic open source bugs that were wreaking absolute havoc on the economy? And what Jim said was that even in open source, we can have market failures. He said there weren't enough eyeballs. And this is in 2015. So today, I got invited here. Steve was like, come talk about open source maintainer burnout. And I've been asked to talk about that topic a lot. I've been asked to talk about open source sustainability a lot. And you know, I think we've talked about these concepts for years. I'm starting this talk citing 2015, but the discussion of these topics has gone way before that. In 2010, there were concerns about there not being enough maintainers, not being enough contributors. This is a tired topic. And I think part of the reason it is a tired topic is because we were framing it incorrectly. And so, despite not being an economist, I'm hoping that we can take a look at this not from the perspective of we have something and we need to support it and sustain it, but that actually we have created a market and that market has failed. And that we need to, if we want to fix this, address it. So speaking of failures, in 2015, I joined a company, and again, many people were often confused about this. I joined a company called NPM Inc. They used to have a slogan called Nice People Matter, which became very uncool after the Black Lives Matter thing happened, and it suddenly seemed very insensitive. This is me standing in front of that sign in the office on my very first day. This is probably the biggest smile I had in that entire job, because it was very, very complicated. I lived through many of the things. I've actually realized we've been aging out of people who remember left pad. Does anyone here remember left pad? Yeah. So I worked at this company, and I was super excited. I had spent all of my career up until this point working on open source. I had worked at the Flatiron School. I was teaching boot camps, and when they told me to close source my curriculum, I quit. I was an open source diehard, and this felt like I get to go work in Mecca now. So I used to give this talk, and people friggin' loved this talk, and I always called it the big numbers are big talk. And so this is, and everyone loved when I said this, I don't know why, but it's a graph of the rolling 28-day downloads, and the numbers are in the billions. And I was like, this is what people in the business world call a hockey stick curve. And everyone was like, woo, We love this. And so this was a very popular thing. Everybody loved the fact that JavaScript seemed like it was growing, and there was just so much success to be celebrated and especially counted. But it really matters what you count, because even though big numbers were big, small numbers were also incredibly small. So this is the GitHub contributor insights page from the NPM CLI that I took yesterday. I don't know how many people know the people who are listed here, but of the top 6, 4 are people who worked at NPM in 2015 when I did. And this is still the core package manager for JavaScript today. Certainly there are many more, and we can maybe guess about why. But for all of those billions of downloads, the number of people maintaining that CLI was usually around 3, which is incredibly small. And the number of people who were managing the NPM registry was about the same. And so despite the fact that NPM looked like it was growing very asymmetrically. And this was a very big problem. So as many people happen to know, NPM ended up not succeeding as a company. It got acquired by GitHub, which was acquired by Microsoft, and not a lot much more was said about it. It may be worth noting that, again, I took that contributor insights page, I took that screen cap 2 days ago. And so being acquired by a large company did not dramatically change the number of folks who are working on that project. And if you talk to the folks who are in charge of that project today, they will tell you that that is absolutely the case. And so NPM, as a company, raised around $20 million. And it wasn't enough. So this is around the time where I think a lot of people with joyous contempt are going to tell me this. A lot of people. They love to say it. Who has tweeted this? There's multiple people in this room who have tweeted this. All right? I think this is deeply unhelpful. So here, take this one up here. How companies misunderstand open source. Okay, I'll be honest. I haven't met anybody who started a company to try and make their open source project their day job who thought open source was a business model. I've never met that person. I don't think they exist. Sure, maybe, I don't know, maybe there's like a couple, but it's certainly not the rule. The people who are showing up and trying to turn open source projects into sustainable companies already know this. They know it kind of desperately. And so when I hear this, I go, why do people say it? Like, what are you trying to communicate when you say something like this? And on bad days, I think they just want people to stop trying, which I think is terrible. It's like, oh, we want people to stop trying to make businesses out of open source projects. And it makes me wonder, like, what do they think the future for open source is if we do that? On other days, I suspect that they are potentially trying to say that we should come up with better business models for open source. And I think that that's more constructive. That being said, I haven't seen any effort in that direction yet from this group. But when people say this, it makes me like deeply angry. And I'll admit that the people who say it, they're never maintainers. It's never somebody who's staying up late at night answering issues. Is there anybody here in the audience who maintains an open source project actively right now? That's a really low number. It's lower than the number of people who said open source isn't a business model. So what about it? What are we going to do? So yes, open source is not a business model, but I think undeniably, it is business. And it's pretty serious business. And I know this because someone at Harvard Business School said so. So this is a screen cap of a paper by, everyone attributes this to Frank Nagel. There are 3 people involved in the paper. But in this paper, they actually did the work of trying to quantify what the value of open source is. And this is really important because it's funny, today we talk about software supply chain and things like that. They estimate somewhere between 70 and 90% of all software in production today is open source software. We can kind of stop saying open source software now. It's just software. The components of all of the software today are basically 100% open source. And they've valued that software today, with a note that it is growing in value, at $8.8 trillion. And open source, it's not a business model, but it's worth $8.8 trillion. The amount of which is captured is functionally 0. So, in 2020, I quit my job to start the Rust Foundation. Has anyone heard of the Rust programming language? Yeah, so there was Mozilla did a thing, and I was on the core team, and I am passionate about bylaws, and I was like, sign me up, I want to do this, I want to do this. And one of the things that happens when you start a foundation, especially if you end up going independent, is that you're in charge of sales. And so it suddenly became my job to sell Rust. And so to start the Rust Foundation, I personally sold more than $2 million worth of Rust to very big companies. And that's a really interesting experience. Oh, no. Don't clap for me, because here's the thing. Open source isn't a business model, but this was the easiest sale ever. Shockingly easy. And so this kind of begs the question, what are companies buying when they join open source foundations? What do people think? I was going to say, hint, it's not nothing. Interesting. So I've heard a couple classic ones. So people really don't, like, they say influence was one that some people said. Foundations love to say that the project is separate, no influence. I also heard marketing. I'll be honest. I mean, shout out to the LF, because I think they're actually pretty good at marketing. But in general, open source foundations are actually kind of awful at it. And so if that was their primary value proposition, they have no business charging what they're charging. It's absurd. All right? So I have a different theory about what they're buying. But I'll start with a theory that I think came from Red Monk, with this post by James, which I had many feelings about, the vast majority of which will not be in the talk. But I think one of the big things that they sell is trust. Like, the point of this article in many ways was the fact that we live in an era of open source license rug pulls, and there's uncertainty. And when companies use open source, they're making a very big investment, and they want to protect that investment. And so this trust is something that they can buy. But I ultimately think, and this is maybe a little controversial, that I think most memberships in open source foundations are selling insurance. So this is an expenditure breakdown from 2023 of the Rust Foundation. It's relatively easy to read, but you can see community grants are kind of this small chunk, and then infrastructure, security, membership, and admin. So the vast majority of what foundations are doing are security, stability, and legal. And those are the things that everyone's really nervous about when they're trying to use open source. And so in many ways, foundations are purposely designed to protect companies when they invest their business models in open source. And this isn't necessarily bad, but I think it's worth calling out that this is what they are paying for. And the thing that I think is interesting about this is that many foundations have just voluminous amounts of content describing what they call the ROI of open source. Tons and tons of PDFs of this, right? And even though open source is not a business model, open source has been a business strategy for proprietary software companies for more than a decade now. And the foundations are purposefully designed to make this the most paved possible path ever. And they've done it super successfully. Just super, super, super successfully. Whoop. They even have little graphics like this. Has anyone seen this? Yeah, I know you've seen it. So I gotta admit, when I read this as a maintainer, I don't feel good. It's okay, you can laugh. But it's true. Like, look at this. 31% of respondents reported that paying for equivalent software functionality would incur 4x the cost. What this graphic says to me is the number one reason, and many, many studies have shown this, there's infinite numbers of research papers on this, the number one reason that companies use open source is because it's cheaper. Why is it cheaper? We'll let that linger. So because corporations have suddenly picked up this incredibly cheap new way to develop software at a rapid rate, there have been some new requirements. And unfortunately nowadays, producing open source software has become exponentially more expensive. Of the maintainers here, who's discovered that they have to do more work now than they did 2 years ago? It's a lot more. And it's largely due to this. So this is the cartoon everybody knows, and this is the really long mouthful of words that people like to talk about now when we talk about open source. The supply chain. How many people here are familiar with the supply chain? Excellent. All right, so we understand that it's a metaphor. It comes from the manufacturing world, which has very different dynamics. People do not use, metal pipes or roofs or things like that just, because they're cheaper. They pay for them. And this is a massive market, absolutely massive market, and it's growing. And you can tell that I am fundraising right now because I have these weird stats. But yeah, fastest growing segment of the dev-led landscape, all right? Top 5 spend category, all right? The attacks are gonna cost businesses nearly $138 billion. That's a lot of money. These are numbers that VCs make bets on because they're big. But there's a problem with the metaphor, and I imagine that many people in this room are familiar with it, is that the supply chain metaphor immediately fails because there actually is no supplier relationship. There is no relationship at all. So how many people have read this blog post? Oh, I'm going to read the spiciest part, but I strongly recommend that you read this. Thomas DePierre, in December of 22, wrote this fantastic paper called I Am Not a Supplier, where he details kind of where the metaphor comes from, and then he talks about why this metaphor falls apart just functionally immediately, because there is no supplier relationship between folks who are consuming open source and the folks who are producing it. And I'll call this out because one of the ways you could create that relationship would be to pay maintainers, but many people are not. And so this is from Tidelift's recent paper. A couple of things to call out here. Even the folks you think maybe are paying maintainers, open source foundations, 3%. The number one at 25% is donation programs, And a very large percentage of that is open source maintainers giving their donations to other open source maintainers in a circle that slowly siphons off fees until it is actually negative. So this is a pretty sorry state of affairs if we're going to apply something like a supply chain metaphor to it. And Thomas agrees. Thomas says this, and the word choice is so perfect, I simply have to read it. So all of your software supply chain ideas, you are not buying from a supplier. You are a raccoon digging through dumpsters for free code. So I would advise you to put these rules in the same dumpster. And remember, I am not a supplier because the software is provided as is. Or is it? So, there is something happening in Europe. There's a specter haunting Europe called the Cyber Resilience Act. How many people here have heard of this? All right, cool. So the goal here, and Europe is good at this, and I hate to sound anti-regulation, but it's gonna come up. The goal of this act is to move liability from the consumer of software delivered goods to the producers of it. And they have introduced some pretty strong requirements, as well as some pretty hefty penalties to folks who are not properly securing the software that gets put on the market in Europe. So the software is provided as is, kind of. This rule actually changes things, and it does apply to open source. Now, when the first draft of this came out, some foundations heard about it, and they wrote this letter. I'm not gonna read this out, but they were like, hey, I think this is gonna have a chilling effect on people building open source software. You really should have talked to us. We are the experts in this. Bring us to the table. We wanna fix it. And they signed off by saying this. They said the undersigned organizations collectively represent the governance of much of the open source software which industry and society rely on. And they were able to carve something out. So open source foundations can now go under this new clause in the Cyber Resilience Act called open source stewards. They carved it out kind of narrowly. And it turns out that actually most open source projects have no foundation associated with them. And they have a single maintainer. And the foundations didn't carve out a spot for them. And so individual maintainers who receive some amount of recurring money from, say, a company are actually going to be held to higher restrictions than open source foundations under the Cyber Resilience Act, which is really unfortunate. The foundations took care of themselves in many ways. But again, the vast majority of open source is single one-off maintainers. And they currently don't have any real solidarity or any real voice at any meaningful table. And the reason I know this is because I've been a maintainer. And so I'm gonna kind of wrap this up a little by talking about a project that I really love that I had to give up. And I'm gonna get sad about it. So when I left NPM, I went to Mozilla, and I got what I thought was really my dream job. I got hired to work on the Rust WebAssembly toolchain. And this was like really exciting to me. And it was funny, they hired me because they were just like, we don't, like, how do you publish stuff to NPM? I didn't realize you could put anything up there. But this was great. And so I think, is there anyone who has used WASM-Pack here? Yeah. Sorry in advance. You know why. So I was super excited about this project. I friggin' love this project. Unfortunately, my contract with Mozilla was only 1 year because Mozilla was obviously going through some struggles, and WebAssembly also was having a bit of an identity crisis. People suddenly realized that you couldn't actually make money from client-side software. You had to put it on the server. Remember that, like, open source first cloud, like software paradigm shift, the cloud. Weirdly, everyone's just putting proprietary software up there and charging for it. I don't know how open source first that is. But yeah, so they were like, you could stay on and be like the one person on client-side WebAssembly. And I thought that sounded awful. But I was like, I'm gonna keep this project. I'm gonna keep working on this project. I friggin' love this project. But it didn't work out. I had to get a job. I went to Cloudflare to work on their WebAssembly toolchain. I actually integrated WASM-Pack into the whole Cloudflare toolchain. But it didn't align with business goals for me to be spending a ton of time on it. And I was doing nights and weekends. It was wrecking my health. And I was just devastated. And so after a while, enough, issue follow-ups where people are like, is this maintained? Can you fix my issue? I had to say that I had to give it up. And this was the worst part, too, is I'm on the Rust core team at the time. Ostensibly, this project is governed by a working group, an official working group. How many folks here are in open source governance, like from a project governance perspective? I'll be curious what your perspective here is, but it always looks more complete from the outside. The biggest problem here was that the Rust WebAssembly group had just completely fallen off the map. It looked like there was a group there because there was a GitHub org, but otherwise, there was nothing happening. And the Rust core team didn't have any resources. We weren't currently under a foundation. I personally don't think that it would have changed anything, but I actually had nowhere to put this project. Like, there was no one to take it. And I frequently asked folks, like, hey, if you're interested, email me. But remember, I worked at NPM, and there had been so many software supply chain security issues with folks transitioning authors and publishers. And this was before we even talked about the supply chain security thing, that I was trying to be really cautious about it. And so ultimately what I decided, despite the fact that the zeitgeist at the time said that people were owed the continuance of an open source project, I said, no, you know what, I think the thing to do is to not give it to anyone. Like, it's just gonna sit here, and you can fork it if you want, and no one did. But I was incredibly sad. And the worst part about this is that it actually kind of haunted me for a while. So, because I love pain and struggle, I went and I Googled some of the Hacker News comments about me and my treating of WASM-Pack, and decided to put them here and just read them out loud to everyone, because I hate myself. But yeah, so, yeah, I loved this one, which was just, she acted incredibly disrespectful towards the Rust WASM team, who worked very hard to make Rust work on WASM, even though she had contributed basically nothing. People don't remember the beginning. They only remember the end. This is a screen cap of the community insights since I've been gone. I took this 2 days ago when I took the other one. Nothing's really happened. But here's the weird thing. So I currently have my own company. We do open source. We're always in people's CI workflows. I see this project in people's CI workflows all the time. All the time. People continue to use this to this day. And so in many ways, it feels a little bit like this project is haunting me. But maybe one day I'll pick it back up. But for now, it just sits like this. And people keep checking in. And so when this happened, it was uniquely poignant for me. Does anyone know what this is? So for folks who don't know, this is a screen cap from a listserv where the XZ attack was first announced. The XZ attack wasn't a bug. It wasn't a bug at all. Or it wasn't a technical bug. So what happened with XZ was that there was a single maintainer on this project. And this maintainer had an experience really similar to me, where he kept getting all of these issues and he couldn't keep up. It was a hobby project for him. And people said pretty awful things. Right now you choke your repo. Why delay what your repo needs? But here's what he did that I'm kind of glad I didn't do, but I don't blame him because I understand why he did. He got bullied into giving maintainership to somebody else. And that person installed a backdoor into XZ. And it's so easy for that to happen. And reading these emails, it just felt terrible. Because I knew that if he hadn't given the maintainership, he probably would have gotten these emails for years, because I did. And his project is way more prolific than mine was. So what about this? What do we do? I've told a couple stories, and I'll be honest, I'm mad about it. I'm like really mad. I'm mad the way it seems like everyone else is mad when someone changes a license to a business source license. So the thing I want to say, and I say dirty because people love to be grumpy about money in open source, but the dirty secret is that there's an immense amount of money in open source. An immense amount. For folks who don't know what a 990 is, Google it, because you can get some numbers, and I'll let you look them up yourself. But I'm telling you now, there's an immense amount of money. The problem is that it's not evenly distributed. So a lot of people don't usually think about this when they think about economics or a market. But the health of an economy or a market, like its whole purpose, is to distribute resources efficiently. And so when I look at how much money there is in open source, and then how much struggle there is, I can't help but think this is a failed market. And so I think we need to stop using this term open source sustainability. And we need to start saying this is a market failure. Because that sounds a lot more serious, right? That has consequences. If somebody kind of doesn't do a lot of charity, that's like, okay. But market failure, you're like, okay. Because market failures have side effects, not just on the demand side, but on the supply side. And I think that's what we need to be paying attention to. So with all these license changes, all this discussion of open source is not a business model, I saw this come across my LinkedIn feed, which has been just a torture device lately. And honestly, it broke my heart. I don't know if anyone else here had a visceral response to seeing this, but the idea that open source should be celebrated as a privilege of successful businesses made me mad. Like extra mad. I spent my entire early career trying to undo open source privilege. The original goal of open source was to be good for the world. It wasn't like being good for making money. It was that it is the right paradigm to protect consumers with software. And the idea that now it's actually good and we should all believe that the only people who get the opportunity to do open source are people who have successful businesses is actually disgusting to me. It makes me very, very angry. If we want open source to be the future of software, it can't just be for people who have successful businesses. It can't. And the idea is ridiculous. And so when I saw that, I was like, we have strayed so far from the light. I remember teaching, teach Git early, let's learn in the open, let's do all this. Open source is supposed to be the way that we want. It's not the reward, it's the path. So to finish out the 2015 Collaborator Summit address, Jim Zemlin said this, and it was interesting to me. He said, "We don't want to create an open source welfare state. We don't want to ruin the market economics that make open source so effective." Now, I'm not here to say that any one person has ruined the market economics, but I do feel confident in saying the economics are pretty ruined at the moment. So in that talk, he announced something called the Core Infrastructure Initiative, and it started out with an initial funding of $6 million, so $2 million a year for their initial raise. This initiative became the OpenSSF, and based on the 2023 annual report that I could find, they had 4.9 million, 2.8 million of which is used for grants. That's a decade of difference. It's not enough. The goal of that initiative was to help single maintainers on projects like OpenSSL, OpenSSH. The funding's the same. It barely accounts for inflation. If this is something that we care about, we either haven't found the right mechanism or we're not paying enough attention. We've kicked this off, we've identified that there's problems, but that same initiative still can't raise more than enough money to cover 5 or 6 projects. So I think open source is at a crossroads. This is another graph from the TideLift survey. And what it's showing is the age of maintainers. It's a bit hard to read, but the message is that they're getting older, and there's not new ones showing up. And who can blame them? So this was like a big thing in 2018. There was a company called Yet that put this on t-shirts. We used to always say open source is about people. And I genuinely believed that. It was something that I felt really important about, the nice people matter slogan from NPM. We thought that mattered. The way foundations ensure open source today is they ensure the projects. We spend a lot of time protecting projects, and we've spent almost no time on the people. So these are my 2 wolves for you, and this is what I leave you with today. So I think there's a struggle going on in open source right now. I think that there are groups of folks who consume open source, and there are groups of people who produce open source. And I think there is an actual struggle happening. Attention is a zero-sum game, and we've been paying a lot of attention to one group at the cost of the other. And so there's a saying that goes, there's a grandpa, he's describing these 2 wolves having a struggle within him, and his grandson goes, "Grandpa, which wolf wins?" And the answer is the one you feed. Thanks.